Can I ask the first question, which in a way you touched on just now? The US, new president, new administration, your former colleagues there, Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, are they up to nationalizing US banks?
Well, the approach they've taken, is a little bit more cautious. If you think about the policy actions of the new administration on banking, on the fiscal issues, on the housing and mortgages problem, you could think of it either as the half of the glass that is full or the half of the glass is empty. The part that is full is you have to give them credit that in less than a month, since they came to power, they've done three big things. One, they have a major new fiscal stimulus plan, $800 billion, to stimulate the economy. I think that's necessary because, as I said, all the other components of demand are collapsing. Unless you have a major fiscal stimulus, the recession is going to become severe. Secondly, they've had a new plan about avoiding mortgages and foreclosures that is going to lead to a reduction of those mortgages and foreclosures. And three, they've come up with a plan with the stress test to try to figure out which banks are solvent and which are not solvent. Now, those are the positives. They've done it in less than a month. But however, the problem is with speed, the quality of the action becomes weaker than otherwise. You've had essentially a fiscal plan that is only 200 out of the $800 billion going to be spent this year, so it's not front-loaded. That's a problem. More of it should be spent this year. The mortgage plan doesn't reduce the face value of the mortgages, and many insolvent households are going to default or walk away from their homes unless you have face value reduction. And for the banks, it's positive that in their plan they've said, we're going to do a stress test. We're not going to throw more public money to bail out insolvent institutions. The day when the plan was presented by Geithner, the market collapsed, in part because the plan was vague, but in part because the market was hoping for a bailout. And instead they've said enough of just throwing money with bailout. So that's the positive side of it. The negative side of it is the bank plan is vague, and they don't want to do the right thing. They're saying we don't want to have our own institution to be nationalized. But at this point, the debate is not about nationalization, yes, or nationalization, not. We've given $9 trillion of guarantee and investments and liquidity to the financial system. The banks are going to be partially nationalized anyhow. Citigroup is already 30% owned by the government. AIG is bankrupt and is effectively, technically 80%, but in practice 100% controlled by the government. So the debate is not anymore about nationalization, on yes or not, but between partial nationalization and full nationalization. In my view, you cannot be, half pregnant, right? You have to recognize that you are pregnant. There is a financial mess. So take over the banks, clean them up, separate the good and bad assets, and then sell it back to the private sector. That's what you need to be doing, and they don't want to do it because they're worried about it. So I would say, that bank plan is still kind of not appropriate, but eventually, the next few months, they're going to get to the point in which they'll have to take over, whether they want it or not, the banks that are insolvent. And unfortunately, even some of the largest financial institutions are insolvent. It's going to happen slowly, slowly. My worry is going to happen too late. And the time to act is now, rather than waiting another 6 months and temporizing, because the problems are severe and they're getting even worse.
One more question before I go to the delegates. 36 months of recession. Growth, no growth in the developed economies. Growth going down in the emerging economies. We were at 9% plus. We are probably at 7% minus, and you mentioned 5% in the last quarter. I mean, are you seeing emerging economies also having no growth?
No, I see on average emerging market economy having as a group positive growth, but as I said, if the average growth rate of EM were to fall this year to say 2% or 3% compared to the average 7% of last year, that's a hard landing, because emerging markets potential growth is much higher. So you don't need negative growth to think about a hard landing or a recession. As I said, growth rate of 5% in China will be effectively hard landing. The manufacturing sector in China is already in a recession. The latest data suggests that 20 to 30 million rural migrants that were in the urban sector have lost jobs. That, to me, is a recession. It has severe social and economic consequences. A number of emerging markets, many of them will have in Asia or Russia, negative growth. There are actually many emerging markets that are on the verge of an outright, not just recession, but also financial crisis, a combination of a currency, banking, and sovereign debt crisis. Look at the emerging Europe. Countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, trouble even in Turkey, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. You could have a financial crisis, severe one in Pakistan. You have trouble in Korea. You have trouble in other parts of Asia. You have trouble in Latin America, Argentina, Venezuela. Ecuador just defaulted for the third time in a decade on its foreign debt. So there's a risk of a fully fledged financial crisis, for example, in emerging Europe. That's even more severe than just a recession. So the EM world in the aggregate is going to have positive growth. But there was a delusion about decoupling, and there is no decoupling. There is nasty recoupling, first in the financial system, in the financial markets, and now in the real economy. That's what's happening right now.
Okay, let's go to the floor for some questions. There's Pawan Munjal there, Suman Berry, and then Srivastava Krishna. That's the first three. Is there a mic, please? Mr. Munjal. Short questions, please.
Very short. You talked about all the economies across the world, and you also included the emerging economies, India, China. While the growth has come down, but there is a huge amount of optimism here, and I'm sure in China as well, that we will come out of this crisis much faster and before the rest of the economies. So when you look around, you've studied everything. Do you think this is a justified optimism for us?
Well, first of all, if I have to say something optimistic, I would say that certainly, in the medium term, the growth opportunities for emerging world and for China and for India are very, very large. This BRIC phenomenon is something for real. These are countries that have high potential growth, high population, are going to become larger and more important parts of the global economy. And I think in the long run, that's certainly the case, as long as all these countries continue the economic, the structural, the financial reforms that they are doing and they've been doing, their potential growth rate could be 7 to 10%, and you'll have a resumption of that growth. And with that change in economic and financial power, it's going to have also important geopolitical and strategic consequences. So that's true. That's happening. And in the long run, from that point of view, I think that's very important. And I think actually this kind of globalization is beneficial not only for those countries, but also for advanced economies. I remember 2 or 3 years ago in Davos, Larry Summers said that the integration of China and India in the global economy was, in his view, the most important event in human history in the last 1,000 years after the Italian Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. And I believe that's the case. It's really a major change is going to shift everything for the global economy. So that's true and important. But in my view, in the short run, over the business cycle horizon, there are significant downside risks. I said that Chinese growth this year could be 5%. That to me is maybe too optimistic. It might end up being much worse than that. If the global economic contraction is severe, if the US and Europe and Japan don't get their act together, there's no way that policy action in China and India by themselves can get them out of this slump. The contraction has become more severe. China is more exposed to trade than India because Chinese exports and share of GDP are a bigger thing, but one of the most dynamic sectors of India is the export sector, especially, as we know, exports of IT services, and that severe US and advanced economic contraction is hurting your exports sharply, and also exports of traditional goods. There is a slowdown in real estate, in auto, in manufacturing. China is less exposed than India is less exposed than China to trade flows, but is more exposed through financial flows because India was running a current account deficit, and many of the banks were financing themselves in part through international liquidity. Now there is a global liquidity and credit crunch. Financing yourself from abroad is becoming more difficult in terms of price and quantity of credit, and that credit crunch is going to lead to a slowdown of credit creation. It's going to be negative for economic activity. So there are many channels of transmission. And of course, appropriate domestic policy can undo some of the shocks coming from the rest of the world. But there are constraints also to those domestic policies. For example, in the case of your country, you're already starting from very large budget deficits and very large stock of public debt. In a country like China, where there was a fiscal stimulus, a fiscal surplus, there is more room for a stimulus. In a country like India, where the deficit overall for the public sector is close to 10% and the stock of public debt is 100% of GDP, the room for fiscal stimulus is more limited. And if that stimulus occurs without medium-term fiscal discipline, then you might have further downgrade, and that's going to increase the cost of capital and borrowing for the government. And all of the borrowing of the government is going to crowd out the amount of savings available for lending to the private sector. So those are all constraints and difficulties that imply that we are in together. Each country has its own set of opportunities, but also of risk and vulnerability.